In the previous video, we talked about the development of the legendary Apollo program. We discussed some of the innovations that were required to make it possible, reflected on the tragedy of the Apollo 1 fire, and then explored some of the uncrewed missions and test flights that got NASA back on its feet and ready to start sending humans back into space in the year 1968. The Apollo 1 fire really shook NASA to its core and forced a near-complete redesign of many internal systems aboard the Apollo command module. NASA and the main spacecraft contractor, North American Aviation, decided not to commit any Block 1 command modules to human flight, and accelerated the development of the Block 2. This saw a whole host of improvements, from the wiring to the now outward opening hatch to the pressurization system that now used a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen on the ground and slowly purged the nitrogen during ascent, ultimately settling on a much lower pressure of pure oxygen atmosphere for the duration of the mission in space. As we discussed, the Apollo 1 fire was the result of a pure oxygen atmosphere at sea level pressure, resulting in catastrophic damage when a spark jumped from exposed wiring to a flammable material inside the spacecraft. The Block 2 would still use pure oxygen, but at a much lower internal pressure of 5 to 6 psi. The crew of Apollo 7, which would be the first crewed flight in the Apollo program, was announced in September of 1966, several months before the Apollo 1 fire. But it would be 2 full years before their mission would be carried out. As tragic as it was, the fire that killed 3 American astronauts in 1967 forced NASA to address many of the building safety and reliability issues that went largely unanswered. The spacecraft that ultimately came out of that review process was much more robust and much more ready to support human lives on a trip to the moon. By the fall of 1968, the crew of Apollo 7, which included original Mercury astronaut Wally Schirra, Donn Eisele, and Walter Cunningham, was ready to fulfill the original mission of Apollo 1, to perform a crewed test flight of the Apollo Command and Service Module spacecraft in low Earth orbit, a so-called shakedown cruise, to put the spacecraft through its motions, exercise its systems, and wring out any bugs in the system that might be a bigger problem for a crew on its way to the moon. On October 11, 1968, Apollo 7 was ready to fly. It was unusually windy that morning, and many, including Commander Schirra, were concerned that a launch aboard early in the mission, or even worse, on the pad, would result in a hard beach landing rather than a splashdown in the ocean. With all systems go, everyone watched and waited as the countdown inched second by second towards zero. All 8 engines of the first stage light up on time, burning a form of highly refined kerosene with fast-flowing liquid oxygen. The launch vehicle generates 7,100 kilonewtons of thrust as it pushes itself off the ground, rolling onto the proper azimuth and slowly beginning what is called the pitchover, or gravity turn. All large rockets lift off vertically, but most of the kinetic energy in a stable orbit is horizontal. Rockets only have to achieve an altitude of around 180 kilometers in order to enter a fairly stable orbit, circling the Earth at 28,100 kilometers per hour. So while the most visible part of a launch is a vertical liftoff, the majority of the boost phase is spent gaining horizontal momentum. By the time Apollo 7's Saturn 1B rocket is ready for staging, it has already pitched down to around 40 degrees above horizontal. Explosive bolts fire, and the first stage, with all of its weight, empty fuel tanks, and big bulky rocket engines drop away. The second stage, powered by a single efficient liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen J2 engine, lights up, and the vehicle continues accelerating out into space. 10 minutes and 26 seconds after launch, the J2 engine in the S4B stage cuts off, and Apollo 7 and its crew of 3 are now in orbit around the Earth. They would orbit the Earth in this configuration for nearly 2 hours and 45 minutes, maneuvering the spacecraft with the massive and nearly empty rocket stage still attached, something that lunar missions would have to do in order to successfully fly their way to the moon. The CSM on Apollo 7 was only partially filled with onboard propellant. It weighed only 60% as much as one that would be sent to the moon. Even so, it was by far the most massive crewed spacecraft that had ever been sent into orbit up to that time, dwarfing previous generations of American and Soviet vehicles. Then, Wally, Walt, and Donn separated the command and service module from the S4B stage, freeing their 16,500 kilogram spacecraft from the massive rocket stage that boosted it into low Earth orbit. The mission of Apollo 7 was open-ended up to a maximum of 11 days. The crew would make several targeted burns with the Large Service Propulsion System, or SPS, engine. They would also test the onboard reaction control system thrusters in both rotation and translation mode. Once separated from the S-4B, the crew turned the spacecraft around and began to practice approaches with a docking target mounted to the massive cylinder. During these exercises, the crew noticed that one of the 4 panels of the SLA, or Spacecraft Lunar Module Adapter, had extended out to its maximum deployment angle and then had bounced back. As the crew practiced a series of maneuvers in the vicinity of the 3rd stage, they relayed this back to Mission Control. For future missions, the hinge on each panel was redesigned so that they would break away upon deployment, leaving no chance that they could close back up and prevent a docking with the lunar lander, which would be nestled in the space within. The crew made a series of rendezvous maneuvers with the tumbling 3rd stage, spending much of their mission investigating the performance of the onboard navigation system, digital computer, and optical as well as radar tracking. They also broadcast the first live television transmission from space. The Apollo guidance system could be recalibrated based off of star sightings performed by the crew, utilizing an onboard telescope sextant and entering data into their reprogrammable onboard computer. They used this system to track the 3rd stage out to a distance of 600 kilometers during the course of their orbital maneuvering. One of the important things that needed to be tested was how the Apollo spacecraft served as a place to live, and many Mercury and Gemini astronauts who were accustomed to incredibly small spacecraft described it as being like a Cadillac by comparison. They had hot water, which allowed them to rehydrate meals and eat them warm, as opposed to previous missions, which consumed everything cold. Apollo was the first spacecraft in which American astronauts could actually unbuckle their seatbelts and float around. They could take off their pressure suits when not firing any engines, and even stow the onboard seats in a way which really opened up a sizable volume inside the vehicle. They actually had a chance to stretch their legs and take advantage of microgravity. However, there was a downside. All this moving around led to some of the first reported cases of space adaptation syndrome. Room to move around meant an increased rate of inner ear confusion, leading to symptoms of nausea and vomiting in a percentage of astronauts. This trend would continue into the shuttle era and even today. It's simply part of the risk of flying into space. Some people can expect an acclimation period lasting up to an entire day. Sometimes it's like having extreme car sickness. For others, it can manifest differently, including the onset of flu-like symptoms. The crew of Apollo 7 developed what they referred to as severe head colds, but modern analysis suggests this was a form of space sickness. By the 10th day of an otherwise perfect mission, the crew was feeling pretty ill and were consuming lots of onboard medication. This illness, combined with the tendency of Mission Control to add objectives onto the flight plan, irritated Commander Wally Schirra. The flight of Apollo 7 was marked by significant tension and disagreements between the crew and the ground, and this came to a head when Wally Schirra suggested, or even demanded, that the crew be allowed to re-enter the atmosphere at the end of the mission without wearing their helmets or gloves. Wally was concerned that the sudden pressure change that could be experienced while wearing the suits could rupture his and other astronauts' eardrums if their sinuses were clogged. Mission Control disagreed and underscored the safety issues that could be experienced if the spacecraft cabin lost pressure during re-entry, something which would actually happen 3 years later in 1971 to the crew of Soyuz 11, killing all 3 cosmonauts on board. However, Wally would not budge. He was adamant that as the commander, he had the final say on all procedures and protocol followed on Apollo 7. As such, 259 hours after launch, the crew of Apollo 7 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere without wearing their helmets or gloves, subjected to a much more gradual increase in pressure as the altitude began to fall. The parachute system functioned perfectly and resulted in a soft landing in the Atlantic Ocean, 370 kilometers southwest of Bermuda. Fortunately, the spacecraft did not depressurize, and the crew were recovered unharmed. The mission of Apollo 7 was an objective success. The spacecraft and crew were able to meet the maximum planned mission duration and accomplish all aspects of their flight plan, providing extremely valuable performance data that would be crucial in planning lunar missions. However, it's largely remembered for the clash between the crew and Mission Control. Wally Schirra, who was by then 45 years old and already looking to retire as an astronaut, didn't care much about future flight assignments. However, the two rookies who came along, Donn Eisele and Walter Cunningham, found themselves blacklisted from future missions, as few in the NASA management structure wanted to work with difficult astronauts who had been tainted by Wally Schirra's mutineering attitude. It would force an examination of the power relationship between the flight crew and the ground support staff that would continue to rear its ugly head in future missions. For Apollo 8, all eyes were on the moon and whether or not NASA dared to commit its next mission and the lives of 3 humans to a trip into deep space.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.